Welcome back to the series aiming to help you read through the Écrits. Today we are going to break down some of the core ideas related to Lacan's clinical structures. In a previous video, we covered the Borromean chain. Today we are going to use this structure, which represents the unity of the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real registers, to analyze clinical structure. Clinical structures are different possible psychic positions that analysis outlines in relationship to the lack in the other. The place of this lack comes to represent the strange coincidence between the subject's symptom in relationship to the lack in the other, as well as the subject's enjoyment, or jouissance, which is addressed to no one. For Lacan, the end of analysis became a process where one comes to identify with the structure of one's symptom as synthome, that is to go from suffering in relation to the lacking other to enjoying the lacking other itself. There are three major different clinical structures. The first is the neurotic structure, defined by the mechanism of repression, and the split into two different dimensions, with the first being an obsessional disposition vis-a-vis the lack in the other. For the obsessional neurotic, the Borromean chain is held together by the question of life and death, and specifically the contingency of one's existence. Can the other exist without me? Can the other lose me? The obsessional thus performs compulsive rituals that are designed to escape the lack in the other, which are often representing some terrible catastrophe or disaster of replacement, where the other can not only continue existing without the subject, but also fully enjoying without the subject. The other side of neurosis can be found in the hysterical neuroses, also constituted by the mechanism of repression. Whereas the neurotic is tormented by the question of life's contingency, the hysteric is tormented by the contingency of one's sex. Specifically, am I a man or a woman? Thus, perplexity regarding sexual identity constitutes the psyche and the lack in the other, a symptom historically connected to the mystery of femininity and the desire of the other. Generically speaking, most men struggle with obsessional neuroses, and most women struggle with hysterical neuroses, although this division is not totalizing. Both neurotic clinical structures form the basis of analysis, namely that both structures are analyzable through the method of free association. The obsessional and the hysteric neurotic can free associate about the lack in the other, and through this process, potentially learn to identify with their symptom as synthome, to enjoy the lack in the other, that the other can go on without one's existence, and that this lack represents the mystery of femininity itself. Thus, in analytic terms, to be analyzable is to be able to pass from the imaginary relation to the other through the symbolic relation to the other, opening the subject to the real of the situation. This is not the case for the second clinical structure, psychosis, which is based on a totally different mechanism, the mechanism of foreclosure. Here, in contrast with neurosis, the symbolic is totally rejected and excluded. An imaginary desire passes through to the real as a delusional fullness or a totalizing wholeness, replacing the lack in the other. It is this process that opens psychoanalysis to the phenomenon of madness, where the external world is replaced by the imaginary as an external world. Due to the fact that the symbolic is foreclosed and rejected in psychosis, analysis cannot treat it. It is outside of analytic method, although analysis still takes interest in the phenomenon. Finally, the third clinical structure is referred to as perversion, and functions on the basis of the mechanism of disavowal. For the pervert, there is a distinction with psychosis in the fact that the pervert is aware of the symbolic as law of a shared social reality, but simply rejects it. And like psychosis, moves from the imaginary directly to the real. This movement is the structural mechanism of disavowal, or, I know very well the law, but nevertheless I act on my imaginary desire. Thus, as opposed to moving through the symbolic, the pervert directly makes imaginary desire the law of the real. Perversion is most distinctly recognized in the structure and the act of the fetish, which is a symbolic substitute for the lack in the other, often leading to subjective instrumentalization as an exhibitionist or a voyeur, as a sadist or a masochist. What psychosis and perversion share is the dimension of being non-analyzable. They are both non-analyzable because free association does not apply when the subject's very structure bypasses the symbolic or intersubjective order and moves directly from the imaginary to the real. These different structures have huge personal consequences for how we experience our own imaginations, our own relation to language and other people, and the way we experience reality. For psychoanalysis, while it cannot effectively treat all of these structures, it still takes interest in all of these structures as the place from which we experience the school of the soul's passions, or the libido, which is infamously difficult to educate. In other words, for analysis, we become educated precisely in relationship to desire and the lack in the other. There are also huge social consequences for these structures, most of which have to do with the dimension of the symbolic, which mediates the dimension of intersubjectivity. Because the psychotic and perverted structures do not engage in symbolic mediation, they tend to act as if sexuality or libido as a raw desire can be acted out without symbolic mediation. Here the self becomes captured by the specular image of jubilation and its reproduction as reality. In contrast, for the neurotic, sex or libido itself submits to a symbolic mediation, either in the face of the real of life and death for the obsessional, or in the face of the real of gender identification for the hysteric. Both of these forms of mediation open pathways to infinite sublimations, which may be less accessible or not accessible to the other structures. Thus there is a benefit from moving from the imaginary to the real via the symbolic, as opposed to bypassing it altogether. However, this does not come without risks. For the obsessional, there is always the risk of defensive isolation due to the real of the other being able to lose the subject. And for the hysteric, there is always the risk of becoming captured in gendered social demands that reduce the subject's capacity for sublimation. Thus, in both cases, the analytic clinic can be a great outlet to the help in the process of moving from symptom to synthome, that is, to move towards the capacity to enjoy the lack in the other. Thus, there is the possibility in the neurotic structure, working with the school of the passions through the symbolic in the embodiment of the image, or in Hegelian terms, the absolute idea as synthome. What is required in this work is nothing but a perspectival shift on the lack in the other as positive. While that may seem simple, it is this simplicity that both the psychotic and the perverted structure refuse in different ways. Now, with an overview of the clinical structures, hopefully you'll have an easier time reading the Écrits and some of the more difficult dimensions of the text. But if you need extra help, Philosophy Portal also has a curriculum that's opening up the foundations of modern philosophy. If you are interested in learning the foundations of Hegel's phenomenology and logic, Nietzsche's Zarathustra, or contemporary philosopher Alenka Zupanchic's work on sexuality, you will find in-depth courses at philosophyportal.online. Philosophy Portal is also an event space. If you become a member, we will be hosting 4 sessions a month throughout 2024. These events will be great places to meet live guests and discuss with others interested in philosophy about the personal connection between one's own life and thinking. These live events will be recorded and available indefinitely for members. I hope to see you there. For more, check out philosophyportal.online, and thanks for watching.